It's always lovely to be with you all. This past September, I attended an all-day event called the Indiana Climate Policy Conference, which was held at the Interchurch Center over by Butler, just up the road from my own congregation. It was put together by a group called Confronting the Climate Crisis. I didn't know anything about the group or the conference, but I was invited to attend by my congregation's very active green team. And I was impressed when I saw the agenda. The organizers were bringing together a terrific group of climate leaders in Indiana, scientists, academics, business innovators, activists, a representative from the UAW, plus local industry and civic leaders. It was an impressive lineup. Plus, I was told there would be donuts. So I pulled up to the Interchurch Center at the same time as several school buses, and they discharged like this large crowd of high school students who beat me to the door. I was gratified to see so many youth attending and vaguely worried that the donuts would be gone now before I got up to the breakfast table, but there were more than enough donuts for everyone. So again, I was really impressed. So I settled into my seat near the front with my coffee and my donut and the agenda. It was a really large crowd. They packed the house. Adults in business garb were in the front of the room. The guy sitting next to me was actually one of our Indiana state legislators. The teenagers were in the back rows, row upon row. We really filled the space. And then I noticed that there were actually teenagers in the front row as well, which I thought was a little curious. And then it was time to start, and a very young person went up to the podium and introduced himself and welcomed us to the conference, which is when I realized that the teachers in the front row were actually running the event because it was their event. And it turns out that Confront the Climate Crisis, the group putting on the event, is a grassroots organization of Indiana high school students, founded in 2020 in West Lafayette, and now including more than 150 high school students across the state of Indiana, including Greater Lafayette, Evansville, Indianapolis, Terre Haute, Fort Wayne, Gary, Hammond, Carmel, Alexandria, and Kokomo. You can find that info on their website. They are high school students organized to do something in Indiana, about climate change. And one of the things this very recently organized group of Indiana high school students did was put together and run one of the best single-day conferences I have ever attended. But they've been up to a lot more than just that. In 2021, they had extensive meetings with Indiana legislators about the need for our state to take climate change seriously. Indiana, if you didn't know, is one of the top 10 carbon polluting states in the country. Very tiny state, very big carbon polluter. So working with Republican Senator Ron Alting, they crafted two pieces of legislation, one creating a climate task force and one calling for a general resolution that climate change is a threat to Hoosiers that we need to take seriously. So that was in 2021 when they did all of this work. So I give you now a headline from January of 2022, an article in the Indianapolis Star by Sarah Bowman. Indiana students demand action on climate change. Lawmakers respond with hard no. Their bills never made it to committee. They weren't even given a hearing. And if you made the mistake of reading the 100 plus comments below the Indy Star article, like I did, you will encounter what feels like a depressingly large number of grown-up Hoosier adults celebrating the fact that the students got told no. And within those comments, if you read them like I so foolishly did, you will encounter what feels like a depressing deluge of invective and abuse aimed at libs and liberalism and environmental wackos and scientists and Al Gore and all things green, heavily laced with climate denialism. One could find it downright discouraging if one were to take all of those comments to heart. But should one take those comments to heart? Here's something I learned at that Indiana Climate Policy Conference that I didn't know, that genuinely surprised me, something that has actually changed my worldview and changed how I think about this issue. The Climate Policy Conference presented the results of a study by IU Bloomington of Hoosier attitudes about climate change, with an emphasis on looking at rural Hoosiers. And the study found that 88% of all Hoosiers and 80% of rural Hoosiers are concerned about climate change. That is most people. And that surprised me, I guess, because the voice of climate denialism is so loud and so abrasive that it had taken up a disproportionate amount of space in my own head. And what I have learned is that while it may sometimes feel like climate change has become one more intractable, irreconcilable issue in our never-ending, perpetually angry culture wars, the reality is we are not so divided after all. In her book, Saving Us, A Climate Scientist's Case for Hope and Healing in a Divided World, Dr. Katharine Hayhoe reports that only 7% of Americans, 7%, fall into the category of what researchers call climate dismissives, people who actively dismiss the reality of climate change and who are probably impervious to arguments about it. 7%. 75% of Americans, which is most Americans, the great majority of Americans, are concerned about this issue. The concern lies on a spectrum from really worried to concerned to cautiously concerned, but 75% of Americans are concerned about this issue. That's most people. The same studies show that 2/3 of people, which again is most people, almost as many people as say are concerned about climate change, say they don't talk about it. We don't talk about it. It may be the single most important issue of our lifetime. 75% of us are some kind of worried about it, and we don't talk about it with other people in our lives. And it may be one of the reasons we don't talk about it is precisely because we think it's such a polarized issue. Maybe we avoid talking about it for the same reasons we don't discuss politics in polite company. We don't want to create a fight. We don't want to make people uncomfortable. But the reality is most people care about this issue, regardless of their politics. And why wouldn't they? Right? It's our planet. It's the only one we've got. It's our future. Hayhoe says research shows that people commonly perceive the other side of an issue. They commonly perceive that the other side disagrees with them more than they actually do. It's a common cognitive misperception that we have. She says, to care about climate change, you only need to be a person living on planet Earth who wants a better future. And chances are that's you and everyone you know. May not talk about climate change is because it's such a bummer topic and one that people tend to feel hopeless about. And no one wants to be bummed out and hopeless. No one wants to be Debbie Downer at the brunch table. But it may be one of the things that leaves us feeling hopeless is precisely the exaggerated sense of isolation and conflict, that we're alone in our worries, that there's so much opposition, that no one is doing anything about this. But Dr. Hayhoe points out in her book that people are doing things about it. Millions of people in all walks of life and in our most important institutions are working on climate change. There are hopeful things to talk about. There are hopeful actions all around. And Hayhoe says, there is no climate silver bullet, but there is lots of silver buckshot, she says. We have ideas and we have solutions and we are making positive change and we are making progress. And the bad news is it's all happening too slowly. We need progress to happen much, much more quickly. We don't need ideas, we need urgency. And how do you create urgency? You talk about it. You talk about it. The number one thing we can do, says Dr. Hayhoe, that any of us can do and all of us can do is talk about this issue with our friends, with our family, our coworkers, our neighbors. In her book, Saving Us, which everyone should read, she gives a lot of thoughtful advice on what that means and how to do it. And here's what it doesn't mean. It doesn't mean to go have an exhausting argument at the Sunday dinner table with your uncle who thinks climate change is a hoax. The 7% of people who are dismissive of climate change can't be argued out of their beliefs. Don't bother unless you just really like arguing, because it's a waste of time and energy. But the good news is that's just 7% of people. The second thing is, don't argue at all, because it's not about arguing. It's mostly about listening, something that we as Unitarian Universalists are encouraged to do. The third thing is you don't have to be a scientist to talk about climate change. You don't have to have a mastery of the facts. The facts are all out there for anyone to find, and there's a lot of evidence that facts don't really persuade people to action anyway. Let the scientists worry about the science. The science on this has been settled since 1850. That's 1850. Instead, she says, start from the heart. Be genuine. The point of a conversation on climate change is to share your concerns, to share your values, and to help other people connect the dots between their concerns and their values. Are you both parents? Everyone wants a safe future for their children. Talk about your concerns for your children and how that inspires you to act. Do you care about the economy? I thought this was fascinating. At the Climate Policy Conference, Alison Zajdel of the Richmond Environmental Sustainability Commission told us this story about Richmond, Indiana. Apparently, Richmond, Indiana is like a national hub for manufacturing dog food. I did not know that. They make a lot of dog food in Richmond, Indiana. And those big dog food companies, the major players, it turns out, they all have corporate environmental goals, like written into their corporate policies, because businesses are thinking about climate change too. So Richmond, the conversation was framed as, what if we put the green-friendly infrastructure in place in Richmond, Indiana, to help those big companies meet their own climate goals? So when they come to Richmond, they're not working against the city to meet those climate goals. They're working together. Then they'll be more likely to bring in those jobs and keep the jobs in the community. So it was a climate conversation, but they talked about jobs. Do you care about the Indiana habitat? As the climate warms, pests and diseases and invasive species are moving north. Did you know there are armadillos in southern Indiana? There are armadillos in southern Indiana. You know what comes next? Fire ants and malaria. But also, changing rain patterns are going to disrupt crops and shorten the growing season. There's a very good reason those rural Hoosiers, that Indiana farmers, are worried about climate change. Do you care about national security? Our military sure cares about climate change. Do you care about our borders? 1 billion people are estimated to be displaced by climate change. 1 billion people. But we don't have to get all big and abstract and doomy. And in fact, scaring people is also not a very good motivator. What motivates people are the things that they love. So again, these are heart conversations. So let's talk about things that people love. Are you an outdoorsy person? There is now an organization of skiers and snowboarders called Protect Our Winters, because one of the things apparently you need if you're a snowboarder is snow. So they talk about the impact of climate change on skiing and snowboarding. Are you a bird watcher, a hunter, a fisher, a beekeeper? Who is talking to your peers about the impact of climate change on your interests? Could it be you? Or could you invite someone in? If you belong to a hiking club or a bird watching club or a kayaking club or a beekeepers club, you can ask, can we bring in a speaker to talk about climate change at one of our meetings? Can we look for something going on in Indiana that we could support? How can we be a part of the solution in some way to protect this thing that we all love? Does your workplace have lunch and learns? Would they invite an environmental speaker to one of those if you asked? Do you belong to a professional group? Are they talking about climate change? If you belong to a book club, can you suggest they read Saving Us by Dr. Katharine Hayhoe? Sometimes it is just a matter of being the person in the room to raise the issue. So what rooms are you in? What are the communities that align with your interests and values and with our interests and values? So for example, Dr. Hayhoe is a Christian, and her Christianity deeply informs her commitments as a scientist to working on climate change. So she talks to a lot of churches. And when she goes to Christian churches, she talks about two things. She talks about Bible verses that call us to care for the earth, and she talks about the impact of climate change on the poor. Climate change is exacerbating the gaps between the haves and the have-nots. Climate disruption falls most heavily on poor communities. So she draws a connection for these Christian churches between climate change and Jesus's teachings about caring for the poor. Now, as Unitarian Universalists, we may or may not have a shared theological language with a person from another faith community. Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. But we can certainly say, I'm worried about how all of this extreme weather around the world is hurting poor communities the most. It doesn't seem fair. It doesn't seem just. And creating a just world where everyone is cared for is one of the most important values of my own religion. And caring for the earth is how we care for everybody. So we listen to people, we affirm shared concerns and values, and then we listen some more. We learn how they see the world so that we can empathize with them. Remember, as Dr. Hayhoe says, you're just opening the door. You're not renovating the house. And if you are able, connect people to a hopeful action, big or small, or a hopeful story. Now, as Unitarian Universalists, another thing that we could do is commit to replacing snark or argument with shared concern and hope. For example, when there's another weather-related climate disaster, we can post a snarky comment online like, I'm so glad climate change isn't real. We can post something argumentative like, it's hard to believe there are people who still deny climate change. But remember, most people don't deny climate change. Most people are concerned about it. So instead of engaging antagonistically with an imagined opposition, we could engage hopefully with the sympathetic. We could post instead, if you are as worried about this extreme weather as I am, here are things that we can all do for our future. And then link to something hopeful. Link to an action that's easy to engage with, right? Link to information about energy efficient housing or reducing food waste or eating lower on the food chain or how to email a senator. Link to a cause to donate to. You can say, I'm proud that caring for the earth is a core value of my church. Now check out Faith in Place to see what other faith communities are doing, or check out the Hoosier Environmental Council or Citizens Climate Lobby. Assume that people are mostly on the side of caring about the earth because they are. Assume that people want to do something about it because they do. Offer people encouragement, affirmation, information, and an easy place to start. And cultivate hope as a practice. Act as though we're all going to figure this out together, and just maybe we will. As the poet says, this is no paradisal dream. Its hardship is its possibility. And as UUs we know, we can do hard things. May it be so, and amen.